At the table with the lemon-printed cloth, the one I'd sewn the year his father died, he told me I was too old to decide things on my own anymore. He smiled when he said it, but it wasn't the kind of smile that warms. It was the kind that lands cold on the skin and then spreads inward like frost. He slid the papers across the table, his voice syrupy, patient, and told me it was all standard, just to make sure everything stayed safe. I nodded. That's what I did back then, nodded. But something flickered behind his tone that made my chest hollow. And when I glanced at the signature line, I saw that my name was already typed beneath his dot. He had always been persuasive. My son, even as a child, he had the charm of a salesman and the calculation of someone far older. When he asked me for things, he never said, please. Not really. He made you feel it would be foolish not to give in. That lemon-printed cloth under our elbows, for instance. When he was 10, he told me no one else's mother made the table look like summer. That's all it took. I sat up all night stitching bright lemons into muslin. He knew how to pull at pride just the right way. I'm so glad you're here. Stay with me until the end and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story travels. Motherhood was never light for me. It was something I carried in both arms. I raised him alone after the accident. His father's brakes failed on the ice just 5 miles from home. I still see the porch light glowing through the snow as I waited that night. And I remember the way my son cried, not with sorrow, but fury. He was only 7, and already he understood that life takes what it wants. I worked nights at the hospital kitchen and mornings at the school library. Wore tired like it was part of my uniform. Still, I never forgot his permission slips, his lunch, his growing. I gave up the piano, my garden, and 2 proposals I didn't dislike. Everything I chose was for his foundation, his future. When he was accepted into law school, I ironed his shirts on the floor of a motel room I rented for a week just to help him move in. I told him quietly that nothing he ever wanted would be beyond reach now. The signs started small, like the way the light changes before a storm. When he visited, he would say I should sit, that I didn't need to strain myself answering the door. Then he stopped calling before visits altogether. I'd find him already inside, chatting with the gardener or the neighbor boy, as if the house had started belonging to him. One time he picked up a letter addressed to me and tucked it under his coat. He said it was probably nothing important. People stopped asking about me. The women from book club started inviting me less. I wasn't mad, I was just forgotten. The last time we gathered, he spoke about new things they were doing with their children. Joint accounts, cosigns, caretakers. I smiled and nodded and folded the paper napkin again and again until it looked like a bird with no wings. One morning, I walked past my own living room and saw my daughter-in-law standing there. Not the one he's with now, but the one he left. 2 years ago, the kind one. The one with the quiet voice and terrible sense of direction. I didn't see me. She was staring at the fireplace mantel like she was remembering something she hadn't meant to feel. My son came in behind her. I don't know if him say that it was just a formality, that I wasn't really managing anything anymore. Later I checked. The mail, there was a statement from a trust account I didn't recognize. I hadn't seen the name of the bank before. I looked at the details and saw that the trustee had been updated. Updated, such a tidy word for something so heavy. I waited until the house was quiet. Then I opened the desk drawer he always used when he thought I wasn't paying attention. It stuck a little. The left rail always catches. Inside were folders with tabs labeled Power of Attorney Estate and Long-Term Care Options. Not for him, for me. I stood there holding the corner of one file like it might bite me. My name was on every page, but it wasn't my hand that had put it there. That the next day, I went to the bank and asked for copies of everything in my name. The teller was young and hesitant, but when I showed her my ID and let her hear the steadiness in my voice, she nodded. I sat in the car afterward with the windows up, just breathing in the stale warmth. The sun had left a faint white ring where my wedding band used to sit that night. I didn't sleep, didn't cry either. I opened an old drawer that still held the ex-wife's Christmas card, the last one she sent before the divorce, still signed in purple ink. She had written that she missed movie nights, that she hoped I was well. I remembered how she used to bring me citrus tea and how she would kiss my cheek in a way my own son never had. It was quiet when I made the decision. No music, no thunder, just me and the soft click of a pen. The next week, I asked my lawyer, the one I hadn't seen in 6 years, to help me revise everything. I watched her eyes widen as she read the new filings. I didn't need revenge. I needed release. So I made the ex-wife trustee. She had no idea. I did it quietly, respectfully, and legally. When I finally told my son, calmly, over tea I had made just for us, he laughed. That kind of laugh that's sharp around the edges. He said I was confused, that it was too late. But it wasn't. I showed him the papers, signed, notarized, processed. He stared at them like they had teeth. After he left, I stood at the back porch and let the wind move through my cardigan like a river. I watched the swing in the yard move without anyone sitting in it. I bought myself a one-bedroom in a town where no one knows my last name. I tend to orchids now. Keep a copy of the revised trust in the top drawer of my nightstand, next to my reading glasses and the old lemon print cloth folded neatly. Waiting for a table that belongs to me, I didn't start out afraid of being forgotten. That came later, slow, like dusk. In the beginning, I thought being needed would be enough to anchor me to their world. And for a time it was. When my son was little, the two of us filled the house with just our shadows. I used to lay in bed and listen to him breathe in the next room, the soft rhythm of it steadying me through the long, hollow nights. He had nightmares after the accident. Sometimes I'd wake to find him curled beside me, one small hand gripping my wrist as if to make sure I hadn't left too. I never did. Not until much later, and even then. It wasn't a leaving so much as a being let go of. I remember when I started calling him sir in little ways. Would you like more tea, sir? Are you coming by this weekend, sir? It was half a joke, but also not. Something shifted in how he looked at me, like I had become part of the furniture. Familiar, functional, not quite a person. When he moved into his new home after the divorce, offered to help clean and unpack. He said there was no need. He'd hired someone. I told him I didn't mind, that I'd bring the lasagna he used to like. He said that kind of food was too heavy now. He was watching his salt. So I stayed home. I placed the lasagna in the freezer and labeled it with a date that would come and go without company. It's strange. It's how silence grows roots. I used to speak with his ex-wife more than I did with him. She'd call to ask if I needed anything, or tell me about a book she thought I'd love. She remembered I liked lavender. Once she mailed me a candle shaped like a teacup. I never lit it, kept it on the windowsill in the guest room, so I'd see it every time I passed by. But after the divorce, her name was barely spoken, as if she were a chapter he had decided not to reread. I wondered if he expected me to erase her too. I didn't. Some people stay stitched into your memory with gold thread. One Christmas, I asked if I could still send her a card. He shrugged and said she probably wouldn't read it. I sent it anyway. She sent one back 3 weeks later with a pressed pansy folded inside. That was the last time we exchanged anything. By the time the calls stopped altogether, I had already rehearsed how to respond to the silence. I told myself he was busy, that work was demanding, that the kids were growing fast. But when birthdays started passing like regular Tuesdays, I stopped pretending. There was one year I got a call from his secretary, not him. She said he wanted to make sure I was doing well. She asked if I needed groceries or a prescription refilled. I told her no. She said good, like it was a relief. I hung up and sat on the porch for 2 hours watching the neighbors. Wind chimes shiver, even though there was no breeze. I tried to stay busy. I read every novel in my library twice. I baked, though I had no one to bake for. I watered my hydrangeas too often and they turned pale from it. I stopped opening the living room curtains. I couldn't bear the look of the empty driveway. Then came the week of my doctor's appointment. It was a follow-up after I'd fainted while raking leaves. Nothing dramatic, I'd been dehydrated. The doctor told me to drink more water and slow down. My son offered to drive me, then canceled the night before. Said he had a deposition. I took the bus and pretended I preferred it that way. In the waiting room, a man across from me held his mother's coat and helped her fill out her forms. She smiled at him like he had just handed her the moon. I tried not to stare. When I got home, there was a note on the kitchen counter in his handwriting. Just for words. Let me handle things. No explanation, no context, no warmth. That note sat on the table for days. I didn't move it. I didn't throw it away. I just left it there like an open wound, catching light and reminding me what had become of us. He was managing my life without asking. Quietly, efficiently, with the same clinical distance he used when arranging appointments for his clients. I had become a client, it seemed. Or worse, a case file. One morning, I caught him in my office. He didn't know I was home. He had the bottom drawer open and a stack of my old documents spread out like cards on the desk. When I stepped in, he startled, but then smiled, smooth as ever. Said he was just helping me sort things before tax season. I nodded. He left. I stood there, the room still smelling faintly of his cologne, and wondered when I had stopped being allowed to own my own decisions. That night, I opened every drawer, every box, every folder. I made a list of what was missing, and it was more than I expected. I couldn't find the title to the house. The deed was gone too. I looked in all the usual places, then the unusual ones. Nothing. That's when the fear started to sink, its teeth in. Not panic, just a quiet, crawling dread. I wasn't just being forgotten. I was being rearranged. They say the worst part of being alone is the absence. But for me, it was the sense of being watched from behind my own curtains. Every choice I hadn't made. Every kindness reframed as liability. Every forgotten bill now paid by someone else as if I were incapable. My son meant well, maybe, but he didn't trust me to be myself anymore. And when trust dies quietly, takes love with it. That's when I found the old card from his ex-wife, the one with the pressed pansy and the handwritten note in that soft lavender ink. I held it like a lifeline. And for the first time in a long while, I knew who I needed to call. I would not be rearranged. I would reappear. I waited. It's a full day before calling her. Not because I was unsure. I wasn't. But because I wanted to hear my own silence before I broke it. I wanted to know if the version of myself I'd been lately would try to talk me out of it. She didn't. She just sat with me in the stillness. When I finally picked up the phone, I held it to my ear like it might crumble if I gripped it too tightly. Her number was still saved. It rang twice. She sounded exactly the same. A little breathless. Like she'd just come in from the garden. I could hear birds in the background. Maybe a wind chime. I didn't say anything for a moment. My name must have flashed on her screen because she didn't ask who it was. She just said my name softly, like it was something she'd kept in a drawer. She asked if I was all right. I told her I wasn't sure. That seemed to be enough. She said I didn't have to explain, and we sat there for a while, the silence between us full but not empty. It felt like leaning into a memory that still wanted you. I told her what had been happening, not every detail, but enough. I mentioned the bank accounts, the missing documents, the doctor appointment I had taken alone. I told her about the lemon print cloth. I don't know why I said that part. Maybe I needed her to remember the table, the house. The version of me that used to belong to something. She didn't interrupt. Just listened. Then, carefully, she asked if I'd thought about getting someone on my side, someone who wasn't family. She didn't mean a friend, she meant legal. That word settled in the room like dust. I had always handled my own affairs. For decades. I'd managed the mortgage, paid off the car, refinanced the house twice when interest rates changed. I kept records in neat manila folders with tabs labeled by season. I was never messy, never fragile, But my son had found a way to make me feel like I'd lost the thread. And once someone puts that idea in your head that you're no longer sharp, it takes hold like a stain, even when you know better. She said she knew someone, a woman she trusted, a lawyer who specialized in elder rights. The phrase made my stomach twist. Elder rights? Was that what I'd become? An aging puzzle to be solved gently and only when convenient? But I didn't say no. I wrote down the name. I didn't tell my son I was going. I let him believe I was still waiting for his updates, still confused, still harmless. That's how I needed him to see me, at least for now. When I walked into the law office, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Not of leather chairs or polished wood, but of orchids. A single pot sat on the edge of the receptionist's desk, its petals a pale yellow that reminded me of summer in my childhood. I took that as a good sign. The lawyer, Claire, was young but steady. She looked me in the eye. She spoke in complete sentences, not that careful, sloping tone people use when they think you don't know what year it is. She asked how I'd been managing things. I told her the truth at first. She just listened. Then she began asking questions. The right ones, about signatures, dates, witnesses. About who had access to my accounts. About whether I'd given permission for any recent changes to my will or my estate. I told her about the missing title, about the trust account I hadn't opened, about the way my son had started speaking about my future as if it were already written down somewhere, and I just hadn't been allowed to read it yet. Claire didn't blink. She said it happened more often than people realized. That sometimes the softest betrayals were the ones that left the deepest marks. It's because they came dressed as concern. She asked if I had anyone I trusted, and without thinking, I said her name. The ex-wife. The one who still sent pressed flowers and remembered my lavender tea. Claire nodded, wrote something down, and said we had options. That night I went home and sat in my chair by the window. The one with the cushion that had started to sag. I didn't turn on the light, just watched the porch across the street, where the neighbors' grandkids were playing with sidewalk chalk. I remembered when my son used to do the same, writing his name in big, uneven letters on the driveway, insisting I take pictures with a disposable camera. He used to ask me to clap when he finished. I always did. Even when it was just a wobbly sun or a crooked dog, somewhere along the way he stopped needing applause. Or maybe he just expected it in silence. The next morning I opened the drawer where I kept my original will. It was still there, unchanged, but it was fragile now, outdated. Not because it was wrong, but because I was ready to rewrite the story of who got to protect me. I called Claire. We set an appointment for revisions. When I told her my plan that I wanted the ex-wife to serve as trustee, not out of spite, but because I trusted her to see me, Claire didn't question it. She just asked me to sign where needed. The pen felt heavy in my hand, not from age, for meaning. That evening, I put the old trust away in a drawer marked Archive. I labeled the new one Current and placed it beside my birth certificate, my passport, and the deed which Claire had retrieved through a simple legal request. Turns out it had been moved to a holding company my son managed, without my consent. But now it was back, my name in ink. Mine. It wasn't war I wanted. It was proof that I still existed, that I still had a name, that I could still draw the line where memory ends and manipulation begins. I called the ex-wife one more time. I didn't tell her what I'd done, not yet. I just asked if she was well. She said yes, then paused, then asked if I was too. And for the first time in months, I said yes and meant it. The house started to feel different after that. Not because anything had changed physically. The walls still held the same nail holes where old frames had hung. The same uneven floorboard. In the hallway still caught under my heel, but something invisible had shifted. I was aware of my own space again. The silence had a boundary now. It didn't seep under doors or curl around my feet like it used to. It stayed outside the rooms I reclaimed. I stopped keeping the curtains drawn. I opened them in the mornings, and let the light hit the wooden table where my son had slid those papers weeks ago. The lemon print cloth was still there, folded now, not spread out as if waiting for an occasion that didn't involve surrender. I thought for a moment that the hardest part would be confronting him, but it wasn't. The hardest part was realizing how far I'd let myself drift from who I used to be, how easily I'd handed over the reins, thinking it was temporary. A kindness, it's a way of making things easier. But ease has a price, and mine had come due in small, silent payments I hadn't noticed until the balance tipped. He didn't call for almost 2 weeks. When he finally did, it was casual. He asked if I'd had a chance to review the trust. I told him I had. I didn't mention Claire. I didn't mention the revised version. I let the silence hang a little before I added that I'd made a few updates. There was a pause on his end. I imagined him checking his calendar, scrolling through his reminders, trying to remember what he thought he'd locked into place. He asked what kind of updates. I said they were just adjustments, small things, simplifications, really. Then I changed the subject. I asked about the kids. He said they were fine. His voice flattened. He said we should sit down soon and go over everything together. Told him I'd let him know when I was free. I didn't mean it. Not yet. That afternoon, I walked out to the mailbox for the first time in weeks. The garden along the walkway was still untended, weeds growing between the violets and lilies I'd once planted with intention. I crouched and pulled a few out with my bare hands. Dirt under my nails felt better than ink on someone else's forms. There was a letter waiting in the box. Not from him, from her. The ex-wife, it was handwritten, folded neatly into thirds. She thanked me for the call. Said she'd thought of me often, especially around holidays. Said she still remembered the way I used to hum while making tea, and how she'd admired the way I always laid out a table like someone important was coming. Even when it was just the three of us, she said she was glad I had reached out. And that if I ever needed someone to drive me to the store or trim the hedge, or just sit for a while, she'd be honored. Honored. That word sat in my chest for hours after I read it. I kept that letter beside the candle. She'd once sent the lavender one shaped like a teacup. That he never lit. I still haven't. Some things are better left glowing. Without fire. In the days that followed, I found myself waking earlier. I made real breakfasts instead of just tea and toast. I cleaned out the cabinet above the fridge, the one with jars long past their labels. I started writing lists again, not because I had much to do, but because the sound of a pen on paper reminded me that I was still here. Deciding. One morning, I caught myself laughing, a real laugh, at a program on the radio. I had forgotten. The sound of it, not just laughter, but my own, made the walls feel warmer. That's when I started preparing, not just to reclaim the legal things, the titles, decisions, the money he'd tried to funnel through locked channels, but to reclaim the rooms of my life, the parts of myself I'd pushed to the margins. The woman who read novels late into the night, who used to bake pies even when no one was coming over, who talked back to the television when the news got too loud. She was still here. Buried under paperwork and politeness, I began going through. The boxes in the attic, most of it was nothing. Old clothes that no longer fit, a broken lamp, a stack of VHS tapes from birthday parties, long digitized and forgotten, but tucked between a photo album and a bag of Christmas ribbons. I found a small wooden box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were keys, 3 of them. One to the safety deposit box I had forgotten I even kept. One to the shed in the back I hadn't entered since his father passed. And one to a small RV we bought together this summer before he died, the kind with a table that turned into a bed and windows that opened just enough to let the night in. We never used it, not once. He died that winter, but I had kept it, maintained it, stored it under the canopy behind the house, and told myself I'd sell it when I was ready. I was ready now, but not to sell it. I had other plans. I took the keys and sat on the back step, staring at the shed, at the RV barely visible behind. The thick brush, the dust on the windows, the rust at the seams, it didn't matter. It could be revived. So could I. I didn't need anyone's permission. I just needed the right moment, and it was coming. I could feel it in the way my heart no longer sank, at the sound of his name, in the way I didn't wait by the phone anymore, in the way the air felt when I stood under the porch light and realized I could walk away from this house and still carry everything. I needed Dot because for the first time in a very long while, I wasn't just surviving someone else's idea of my life. I was remembering how to live in my own. I didn't tell anyone I was going to the bank that day. I put on a soft gray sweater, the one with loose sleeves I always liked for long errands. And I packed a folder in my bag labeled neatly with tabs. Not because I needed to prove anything, but because order still gave me something to hold on to. It's strange how paperwork, when it's yours, can feel like a kind of armor. The bank hadn't changed in years. Still the same outdated lobby. Chairs with sun-faded arms. The same artificial plant near the teller window. I remembered sitting in this very branch when we refinanced the house in '98. Back then, a husband had done all the talking. I had nodded a lot, smiled at the woman behind the desk. Worn perfume, I thought, smelled expensive. Now it was me at the center of the conversation, me with the questions, me with the numbers memorized. The manager, a man not much older than my son, took me into his office. He had a polite smile and a framed photo of 3 little girls on his desk. He seemed kind, but there was something in the way he paused before each sentence that made me realize he was choosing his words carefully. I imagine he'd had to do that with older clients before. Maybe some of them had forgotten account numbers or come in flustered. But I wasn't flustered. I placed the folder on his desk, opened to the tab marked Trust Transfer Records, and asked him to review the beneficiaries. Slowly, out loud, he clicked a few things on his screen and cleared his throat. Then he looked up at me, his voice a little lower. He said my name was listed as the grantor, but the trustee had been changed 3 months ago. It's my son. I asked if there was a witness on file. There wasn't. I asked for the signature date. It didn't match anything I remembered. I told him I had never signed such a form and that I had a new version. It's prepared and filed with full authority. His eyes widened. It's just enough to betray what he was thinking. She knows exactly what she's doing. I slid the revised documents across the desk. He looked them over in silence, page after page, then nodded. He said they were clean, clear, complete. I watched him scan and upload each one. The sound of the printer taking in the pages was sharp and satisfying, like the click of a door locking. Shut, but this time from the inside. When I left, the sun had come out, not brightly. It's just enough to lay a warmth across my shoulders as I walked back to my car. It was the same sky, the same street, the same car. But it all looked slightly different now, like I'd wiped fog off a mirror. On the way home, I stopped for groceries. I hadn't done that in a while, not properly. I usually let the delivery service drop things off. It's the same way my son had suggested months ago when he said I shouldn't be wasting energy on errands. But this time, I walked every aisle slowly. I bought lemons. Not for tea, for the cloth. I wanted to lay it out again, this time for myself. I bought garlic, fresh parsley, a small bottle of wine. I hadn't cooked something from scratch in weeks, maybe months. Everything lately had been microwave safe. But that night I wanted the kitchen to smell like purpose, and it did. The garlic sizzled in the pan like applause. The herbs bloomed in. The heat. I poured 1 glass of wine and sat by the window while the sauce simmered. I didn't rush, didn't turn on the television. I just let the room be full of small sounds, the bubbling stove, the creak of a chair, the quiet rustle of wind through the screen door. When I finally sat down to eat, I unfolded the lemon cloth. I laid the plate on it carefully, like I was serving someone important. The mail came late that day. Among the usual flyers and statements, there was an envelope I didn't recognize. No return address. Inside was a letter from my son, 3 pages. Typed, he said he'd heard about the change in trustee. He called it a surprise. He said he was concerned that these decisions could impact my well-being. He reminded me that he had experience with financial matters and that it would be safer for me to let him handle things. As originally planned, he even offered to review the documents with an estate specialist on my behalf. There was no mention of the missing title, no apology for the forms I hadn't signed, no acknowledgement that he had done anything behind my back. He closed by saying he loved me and that I should call him when I was ready to talk. Ready, as if I had been sitting quietly in the dark, waiting for a door he held to open. As if all of this had been a misunderstanding. Rather than a removal, I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with the candle and the pansy card. Not out of sentiment, but because I wanted to keep everything in one place. A record, not of love, but of what had been mistaken for it. That night, I stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door to the room that used to be his. The posters were long gone. The old dresser still stood there, dusted but unused. If I hadn't stepped inside in years. I opened the door slowly. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old linen. I sat on the edge of the bed and let my hand run across the coverlet. It was the same quilt I had stitched when he left for college. I remembered picking out the fabric, choosing colors I thought felt like home. Mustard gold, slate blue, soft. Cream. I had imagined him sleeping under it in some far-off dorm room, comforted by the weight of where he came from. Now, the weight was mine to carry, but lighter than before. Because I had done it, the thing I feared I couldn't do. Not the legal part. Not even the financial part. I had remembered who I was before he told me otherwise. And that, more than anything, was the beginning of freedom. He came by the following Sunday. Unannounced, it was just after lunch and I was pruning the garden bed. Beneath the living room window, the shears were dull and my knees ached from crouching, but I didn't mind. It felt good to tend to something, to shape and clear and know that the changes I made were my own. I didn't hear his car pull in, but I heard the front door creak open. Not knock, not ring, just open, as if the house still belonged to him. I stood up slowly, brushed soil from my palms, and walked to the porch. He was in the foyer, glancing around like a stranger who had returned to a place that had shifted in his absence. He turned when I stepped inside, smiling in that polished way he always had when he was trying to steer a conversation before it started. He said he was just dropping by to check on me. Said he'd brought a folder from his office. A few things I might have forgotten to mention. I nodded toward the kitchen table. He set the folder down like it was something delicate, even though he hadn't handled me that way in months. He asked how I was feeling. I said fine, better than before. He didn't like that answer. I saw it in the way his mouth paused, just slightly. He motioned to the folder and said there were some documents I might want to review. He sat across from me at the table, and I noticed he didn't take his coat off. He was expecting a quick conversation, a signature. A correction to the narrative I had finally rewritten. I didn't touch the folder. I asked him why he'd changed the trust without telling me. He didn't answer right away. Just looked past me toward the window. Said something vague that he had assumed I was ready to let him manage things. That he had always acted with my best interests in mind. That these were complicated matters. I asked him again, this time slower. Why did you change it without telling me? He leaned back and smiled like he was explaining a lesson. Said I had been overwhelmed. That I hadn't been myself. That when he visited that day with the papers, I hadn't really objected, and in his mind, that counted as consent. He said the word like it was something shallow, something implied. I sat very still. My hands were resting on the lemon-printed cloth, the one I'd laid out again just that morning. Not because I was expecting company, but because I wanted it to remind me that I still had rituals worth keeping. I told him the trust had already been revised, that the bank had accepted it, that I had filed it properly, legally, and with full awareness. He blinked, not in surprise, keen calculation. He asked who had helped me. He didn't say it with curiosity. He said it the way a surgeon asks a question before slicing open the truth. I told him her name, Claire. And then, before he could pivot, I told him I'd spoken with his ex-wife. That landed differently. He sat forward, eyes tightening. Asked why. I would involve her. what she had to do with any of this. I told him the truth. That she had seen me, listened, that she had reminded me of a time when I was still allowed to make decisions in my own house, that I trusted her to carry a torch if I ever lost the map. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he laughed, short, sharp, thin, said this wasn't about trust, said this was about control, about fear, about getting old and confused and clinging to familiarity instead of accepting help. I let him finish, let the silence stretch. Then I asked him if he remembered the summer I worked his shifts at the hospital just to keep the lights on. If he remembered when I pawned my grandmother's ring to pay for his first suit for debate club. If he remembered who kept every receipt, every bill, every deadline, while he was away building his name into something sharp and spotless. He didn't answer. He just looked down. I told him I may be older now, but I was not confused. I had been quiet. There's a difference. He said I was being dramatic, that I'd taken things too personally. I stood up, not abruptly, just enough to remind him that the house still echoed my footsteps louder than his. I told him the documents he brought weren't needed. I would not be signing anything he hadn't had the respect to explain in the first place. I told him that if he ever wanted to visit, he could call first, like a guest. He stood too, and for the first time he looked uncomfortable, not angry, not ashamed, just off balance. He said he'd go. I walked him to the door. He paused on the porch, staring out at the garden, at the small rows I'd cleared earlier that morning. He asked if I'd done it myself. I said yes. He looked like he might say something else. But he didn't. He walked to his car and drove away without looking back. When the engine faded, I stood there a moment longer, holding the doorknob in one hand and the memory of my own voice in the other. I had done it not with anger, not with shouting, just with truth. With a steady, quiet kind of truth that sits between your ribs and makes its home there. Not loud, but lasting. I went back inside and folded the lemon cloth again, not because I was finished with it, but because I was preserving it. For the next time, I wanted to set the table for someone who understood what a table means. Not just a place to sit, but a place to see someone. The day after he left, I opened the windows, not just one or two, but all of them. I wanted the air to move through the house like a second wind, like something clearing out what had been sitting too long. The curtains shifted and the corners of the rooms brightened. Even the dust looked lighter in the morning sun. I didn't feel triumphant. That isn't the word. I felt returned to myself, like I had found the switch that turned the lights back on. The first call came that afternoon. It was from Claire, my lawyer. She said she'd had a message from his office. Vague, formal. His assistant had asked for an appointment to review current filings. Claire said she declined on my behalf and told them any inquiries should come directly through me. Then she paused, asked if I was all right. I told her I was. Then, after a moment, I added something I hadn't planned to say. I told her, thank you, not for the legal work, but for the steadiness. The way she never looked at me like I was someone unraveling. That matters more than people think. After I hung up, I brewed a pot of tea, not the quick kind, but loose leaf, steeped with intention. I sat on the back step with my favorite cup, the one with the crack along the rim that I always turned away from my lips. I watched the birds land in the hedge. I listened to the wind move through the grass like breath. Then I reached for the letter I hadn't written yet. It had been on my mind for days, a quiet whisper behind everything else. I wanted to write to her again, not Claire, not him, her, his ex-wife, the one who still signed her name in lavender ink, the one who had once braided my hair for a wedding and helped me sort a decade's worth of family photos when we repainted the hallway. The one he had dismissed like a chapter he was done reading. She hadn't asked to be included in any of this. And I hadn't asked her to carry the weight. But she had, in her way. And I wanted her to know that it meant something. So I wrote, not a legal letter, not a request, just a few pages of truth. I told her what I'd done about the revised trust. Hey, and how I'd listed her as successor trustee. Not because I expected her to do anything right away or ever. Just because she was the only one I could name who had never looked at me like I was past tense. I told her about the lemon cloth, the garlic and wine, the silence I'd lived inside, and the day it finally cracked open. I told her she had helped more than she knew. Then I folded the letter, sealed it in a soft blue envelope, and dropped it in the mailbox before I could talk myself out of it. That evening the phone rang. It was Miriam, the neighbor 2 houses down. The one with the stained glass hummingbird in her window and a cat that never stays inside. She said she'd heard not everything, just whispers, and asked if I might want company sometime. Nothing formal, just tea, maybe a puzzle. I nearly laughed. I hadn't done a puzzle since my hands were steadier. But the offer made something soft rise in me. I said yes. She brought over lemon shortbread and a jigsaw of Monet's garden, still sealed in plastic. We sat at the table with the cloth I hadn't yet put away, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I had to explain anything. She didn't ask what had happened. She just said sometimes the hardest thing is proving to people that you're still living in the center of your own life, not the edges. I nodded. I told her about the RV in the back. She raised an eyebrow and asked if it still ran. I said I wasn't sure. She said she had a brother who could come by and take a look. I hadn't meant the RV as more than a memory, a symbol of a freedom I hadn't quite believed I could take. But as we sipped our tea and the puzzle pieces started to find their corners, I let the idea unfold a little more. Maybe it didn't need to stay covered in dust. Maybe I didn't either the next week. Her brother came by. He wore a cap with a faded baseball logo and had the kind of hands that knew how to make old things useful again. He looked over the RV, nodded once, and said it would take a little love, but she could run. That word, she made me smile. He gave me a list. New battery, fluids, tires checked. He said he could help with all of it. Wouldn't even charge me labor. Said it was nice to work on something real. I stood in the doorway of the shed that afternoon, watching him work, and realized something I hadn't dared believe before. I wasn't alone. Not in the loud, crowded way of dinner tables and family vacations, but in the deeper way where a neighbor says, "I see you." And an ex-daughter-in-law sends a card with a flower pressed inside, where a lawyer takes you seriously, where your own breath feels like your own again. The house no longer felt like a waiting room. It felt like a chapter, not a last one, just one where the writing was finally mine again. I still hadn't heard back from him, but I no longer woke up hoping he'd call. I woke up thinking about roads, about maps, about that RV, and what it might feel like to drive past the town line with no one asking when I'd be back. Maybe I wouldn't go far, but maybe I would. Either way, it would be mine, and I would never again ask permission to live the rest of my life. The first time I turned the key in the RV's ignition and heard it hum back to life, I cried. Not loudly and not all at once, just a few silent tears that slipped down while I kept my hand on the wheel. The engine stuttered at first, then evened out like a voice that hadn't been used in years but still remembered how to speak. That's how I felt too. Like I'd been quiet for too long, and now there was sound again. Miriam's brother had done more than I asked. He replaced the old tires, fixed the brake lines, even installed a new rearview mirror that didn't rattle. I told him he'd gone above and beyond. He just tipped his cap and said something about how second chances deserved good footing. I started sitting in the RV every morning. Not going anywhere yet, just sitting. I kept the door open to let in the air. I would bring my tea and a small journal I hadn't touched in over a decade. I wrote lists at first, then lines, then thoughts. They weren't poems, not exactly. Just the kinds of things I hadn't given myself space to write. One morning I wrote, I used to ask what day it was for their sake. Now I ask it for mine. I hadn't realized how many days I'd let pass without naming. It's easy to lose track when your life is managed in quiet. Pieces by someone else when the calendar becomes theirs, the meals tailored to their schedule, your health arranged around their convenience. Oh, that was over. The calendar was mine again. Blank squares waiting to be claimed. I bought new bedding for the RV, blue with little white dots, like stars on a clear night. I added a small cushion to the bench seat and stitched a patch into one of the curtains where the fabric had worn through. I lined one drawer with lavender paper and filled it with tea bags, pens, and a travel-sized flashlight. Another drawer held a copy of the revised trust and a manila envelope with copies of everything that mattered, just in case. One afternoon, I parked the RV at the edge of the yard and turned it so the front window faced west. The sun poured through like honey, warm and golden and forgiving. I sat there until the light dipped low and turned everything soft. That night, started making real plans, not just for leaving, but for everything after. I looked up small towns I'd once dreamed of visiting, places I'd circled in magazines. Back when his father was alive and we thought we'd grow old taking long drives on open roads. I kept the list realistic. A coastal town with a local bakery, a lake village with a used bookshop, stretch of farmland where wildflowers bloom against wire fences in June. I wasn't running away. That's important to say. I was choosing theirs. A difference. In the weeks that followed, I slowly began to untether myself. I canceled the cleaning service he'd insisted I use. I redirected my prescriptions to a pharmacy on the other side of town. I spoke to Claire about a few final changes. Small things, accounts closed, names removed, decisions sealed. I even added a note to the trust that the house could be sold if I didn't return within a year. He wouldn't like that. But it wasn't. For him to like, the house had been a home once, then a memory, then a cage. Now it was just a structure. A place that had served its purpose. I didn't hate it. I was simply done with it. And then one morning, something unexpected happened. A package arrived. I hadn't ordered anything. It was from her, his wife, wrapped neatly in brown paper and tied with twine. Inside a book of poetry I'd once lent her, my name still scribbled in pencil on the inside cover. Tucked into the pages was a letter. Handwritten, lavender ink. She said she'd read my words over and over, that they made her cry. That they made her remember not just me, but herself. Who she had been before the divorce, before the silence. Before she was reduced to a line in someone else's story, she said she would be honored. Truly honored to act as trustee if ever the time came, that no matter where I went, she hoped I'd send a postcard. Even if it just said "still here" at the bottom of the letter, she had drawn a tiny pansy. That night, I sat on the porch with the envelope in my lap and watched the porch light flicker in the distance. I thought about how many years I'd waited for someone to save me. How many chances I'd given to people who only wanted control. And how easily kindness can come from the people you're told to leave behind. She was never the problem. She just didn't stay quiet. Maybe that's why I loved her. The next morning, I packed a small bag. Nothing heavy. One suitcase with soft shirts, clean socks, and a photograph of me holding my son when he was 4. His eyes were squinting in the sun, and I looked tired but proud. I left the photo face down in the drawer. I didn't need to bring everything with me, just enough by evening. The tank was full. The windows were clean, and I had mapped my first stop, a little town 2 hours east, where the leaves had just started to turn and the pie was rumored to be worth writing home about. I didn't leave that night. I gave myself one more sleep under the roof that had held me all these years. One last night to breathe it in, to say thank you, not to the walls, but to the woman I'd been inside them, the one who survived long enough to remember how to live. I woke before the sun, not to an alarm, just a quiet nudge from somewhere inside me. It's a kind of waking that doesn't come from restlessness, but readiness. The house was still. I moved through it barefoot, slow and steady, like I didn't want to startle it. I filled the kettle one last time. It's the same old white enamel one, chipped at the spout. I'd had it for almost 40 years. I didn't pack it. I left it clean, warm on the stove, like a memory folded into linen. I drank my tea at the kitchen table. No cloth this time. No plate. Just the steam curling upward and the soft clink of the spoon as I stirred. I kept looking at the clock. Not because I was late, but because I wasn't. I had nowhere to be, except away. There was a letter already waiting on the counter, not for me, from me. Addressed to my son. I'd written it the night before. Once. The house had gone quiet and the porch light had flickered off for the final time. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't emotional. It was clear, calm. A list, in essence, of what had been transferred, of what had been reclaimed, of where to find the updated documents, and what not to expect anymore. No accusations, no anger, just a firm and gentle ending. I signed it simply. Take care of yourself. I'll be doing. The same dot I left it next to the envelope from his ex-wife. The one with the lavender ink and the small pressed pansy still holding its shape. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd read it. And remember who used to bring her flowers just because she loved the smell of them on the porch stopped by 6:30? I was in the RV. I didn't look back when I started the engine. Not because I was trying to be dramatic, but because I didn't want to give the house the power of a farewell. It wasn't a person. It didn't own me. I had given it enough already. The road was soft at that hour. Barely stirred. A long ribbon of gray stretching ahead. Like possibility. I didn't have a playlist or a podcast. I didn't want noise. I wanted to hear the tires hum, the wind press lightly against the side panels. I wanted to feel the motion in my body, the proof that I was going. The first town came quicker than I expected. It's a small curve off the main road where the air smelled like warm leaves and chimney smoke. There was a sign hand-painted in white that read, "Welcome to Greystone Hollow. Pie Daily. Be kind." I pulled over next to a park bench, carved with initials, and watched a boy ride by on a rusted blue bike. He waved. I waved back. It felt like something had been put back where it belonged. I stayed 2 nights in Greystone. The RV parked neatly along the edge of a small lot behind a diner. The owner, a woman named Esther, with thick gray braids and a laugh that cracked wide open, said I could stay as long as I wanted. I told her I wouldn't take up much space. She said I wasn't the type to take anything that wasn't mine. Then, second night she brought me a slice of peach pie on a plate with a chip in the rim. It was warm, heavy with cinnamon. I ate it with a plastic fork on the step of the RV and let the stars rise without rushing. I didn't tell anyone where I was. That was the point. To belong only to myself. Each morning, I wrote in my little journal, new lines this time. Not lists, not fragments. Thoughts fully formed, soft but sturdy. One entry read, "The world didn't get quieter." I just stopped shouting in my head. Another said, "I am not too old. I am exactly the right age to be free." I mailed one postcard on the 3rd day, just one dot to her. The ex-wife, the lavender ink woman. The keeper of truth when truth got slippery. I wrote only this, still here, more than ever. I didn't sign it. She would know by the end of the week. I'd circled 2 more places on my map. A town with a sunflower farm and a thrift store with a poetry shelf. A fishing village with benches that faced the water. Where? No one would ask who you were waiting for. I didn't have a timeline or a plan, just a direction forward. The trust was safe. The house was no longer mine. The name on the accounts was mine again. But more than that, my life was mine again. Not in some grand cinematic gesture, not with applause. Just in the way my breath felt when I took it in deeply and realized no one was waiting for me to explain. I thought I might feel lonely. But I didn't, not once, because loneliness is the absence of connection. And I had finally reconnected with myself. I drove through a tunnel the next morning, carved clean through a hill of rock, and when I came out the other side, the road was bright and open. It felt like permission, like grace. The kind you give yourself when you finally stop trying to prove that you're worth listening to, because you've already heard your own voice. And that's enough. And as I drove, the sunlight catching the corners of the windshield, I whispered softly, to no one, to everyone. It's myself. Still here? I didn't expect the letter from the attorney's office to find me on the road, but it did. Forwarded. It's with a little yellow sticker on the corner. It arrived in Greystone Hollow just as I was planning to leave. Miriam had added the forwarding address for me, just in case anything important found its way through the cracks. I hadn't asked her to, but I was glad she did. Sometimes people see your needs before you're willing to name them. The envelope was thick, not ominous, just official. The kind of paper that expects to be taken seriously. I sat at the RV table with the door open. A breeze moving through the curtains and opened it slowly. There was a letter from his lawyer, a new one, not the one he'd used when he filed the original trust amendment without my consent. The tone was measured, careful. They were requesting a meeting, not a threat, not a lawsuit, just a conversation, to clarify the recent changes and to ensure everyone's interests remained aligned. That last phrase stayed with me. Remained aligned, as if there had ever been a shared center to begin with. I knew what it was, a test, a fishing line cast with polite bait, hoping I'd bite and swim back to familiar waters. But I wasn't the same woman anymore. I didn't belong in the tank he'd built around me. Still, I called Claire. I told her about the letter. She asked if she should respond. I said no, not yet. Then I asked her something else. I asked if it was possible, legally and cleanly, to attend the meeting. But not alone. There was a pause on her end of the line. And then she said yes. Of course she said she'd be there. And then, before we hung up, she asked me if I was sure. I told her I'd never been more, because it wasn't just about the papers anymore. It was about the room, the table, the language people use when they want to box you in without leaving a mark. I was done sitting quietly while other people redefined what I needed. I wanted the words to come from me this time. We met at the attorney's office downtown. It's a tall building with glass walls and a lobby that smelled like disinfectant and too much money. I wore a soft blue sweater and my hair up, not because I wanted to look younger, but because I wanted to look like myself. Claire met me in the lobby with a nod. No hand-holding, just presence. It's all I needed. We were led into a long conference room with too many chairs and a view that looked out over a parking lot. He was already there, my son. He stood when I entered, but didn't come forward. Just smiled tight and unreadable, like someone waiting for a chess game to resume. He gestured to the seat across from him. I took the one beside Claire, his. New lawyer started speaking first, soft-voiced, careful. He said they were aware of the revisions, that it was unusual for a third party, meaning the ex-wife, to be appointed as trustee, that it had raised questions about my state of mind, my memory, and whether I had been unduly influenced. I let him finish. Then I placed a folder on the table, neatly. Quietly inside were medical records. It's a cognitive evaluation I had taken last week, at my own insistence, from an independent neurologist. Test results, letters of capacity, notes from my primary doctor. Every line marked fully competent, capable of managing all legal, financial, and personal matters. Claire let the silence stretch before she spoke. She said my choices were sound. My signature verified, my capacity confirmed. She said we could furnish additional documentation if needed, including the timeline of the trust's original unauthorized amendment, which we were still prepared to challenge. Should this meeting continue in the current direction, then she turned to me gently and asked if I wanted to say anything. I did. I looked at my son, not with anger, not even hurt, just clarity. I told him I wasn't confused, that I hadn't been confused when I revised the trust, that I had made that decision because I could no longer trust him to protect me without first protecting his own interests. I said I understood why he did what he did. That fear can dress itself up in logic, that maybe he thought he was helping. Or maybe he just didn't want the burden of my independence complicating his version of the future. Either way, I said. I am not his burden, and I will not be his project. He said nothing for a long time. Then he looked at the lawyer and said the matter was closed. The meeting ended. Quietly, Claire and I rode the elevator down in silence. When we stepped out onto the sidewalk, she asked if I was okay. I said yes, but I wasn't just okay. I was whole. Something had closed that needed to be closed. It's not with a slammed door. Just a latch quietly sliding into place. That evening, I sat in the RV and watched the clouds pass across the darkening sky. I thought about how many years I'd spent waiting for someone to give me permission to move forward, to be trusted, to be seen, and how it had finally come, not from my son, but from myself. In the distance, a freight train passed, low and slow, its whistle stretching long across the hills like a voice calling something home. I didn't answer. I just listened because some things don't need a reply. They just need to be heard. I stayed in the next town longer than I planned, not because I was avoiding anything, not anymore, but because it felt good to stay without reason. 2. Wake up without a list. To walk without an errand waiting at the end of it. The town was called Sparrow's Ridge. Just one long main street. A diner with booths that creaked when you sat down, and a little hardware store that sold more candy than tools. I parked the RV in a gravel lot behind the library and paid $10 a day to hook up to power. The librarian said I could come in any time, no card needed. She gave me a mug of coffee and a yellow notepad when I mentioned I liked to write things down. She asked where I was headed. I said I wasn't sure yet. She nodded like that made sense. In Sparrow's Ridge, no one asked where your family was. They just asked if you'd tried the blackberry cobbler yet. I walked a lot, sat on benches, talked to dogs tied up outside shops while their owners bought milk and newspapers. I found an old church with blue stained glass. Windows that didn't mention hell or consequence, just light and hope and music. I sat in the back pew one morning and watched a woman sweep the floor in silence. Her movements were slow, like she wasn't in a rush to finish, like sweeping was its own kind of prayer. She didn't speak when she saw me, just smiled and kept going. I thought about how many years I'd spent rushing to clean things before someone came over, how many rooms I had tidied without being seen in them. Sometimes your whole life becomes a performance for people who stop clapping long before you're done. But in that quiet church, I didn't have to perform anything. I started cooking again. Real meals, even if they were just for me. A small pot of lentils, toasted bread with rosemary, warm apples with cinnamon. I ate slowly, not in front of the TV, but by the window, letting the steam rise and fill the air with proof that I was nourishing myself not out of duty but out of care. And every night I wrote not about him or the past or the house, but about small things, the color of the trees outside the RV, the sound of gravel under bicycle tires, the way the sun set in this part of the country, not in a burst, but a slow dissolve. I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace, not the kind that comes with certainty or control, the kind that comes when you stop needing either. One evening, I walked into a secondhand shop looking for nothing in particular and came out with a scarf. Soft, deep green, the kind of green that feels like shade in summer. I wore it even though it wasn't cold, just because. I liked how it felt against my neck. The woman behind the counter said it suited me. I said thank you, not out of habit but with real gratitude. Later, I passed a cafe and saw a group of older women sitting around a table playing cards and drinking lemonade. One of them waved at me like she knew me. I waved back, even though we'd never spoken. It didn't matter. Some gestures don't need history. They just need presence. That night, I wrote something new in the journal. No one can steal your life if you remember how to live it. It felt like something I should underline, so I did. Twice the next day I walked to the post office and bought a stamp with a bluebird. On it I wrote another postcard. This time I sent it to Claire. Just a few words. Thank you for reminding me what my signature means. I didn't sign my name. She would know. That same afternoon, I took the RV for a short drive to a nearby overlook. There were wildflowers growing in patches along the guardrail, and a wooden sign that said, "You are here," in small, worn letters. I stood at the edge and let the wind move through my sleeves. I closed my eyes and I said it again, not out loud, but inside me. Where it mattered, still here. But it wasn't just survival anymore. It was being. It was color returning to my thoughts. Hunger returning to my evenings. Laughter, not because something was funny, but because I remembered how to find joy in a sliver of sky, or the way a dog's ears bounced when it ran. I hadn't expected this life. I hadn't even dared to want it. But it was here, soft, quiet, mine, I. Didn't know where I was going next. Maybe the lake, maybe the coast, maybe nowhere for a while. But I wasn't lost, for the first time in years. I wasn't trying to get back to anything. I was finally on my way. Forward, it had been 32 days since I left the house. I hadn't been counting at first. But one morning, while sipping tea near the lake, I flipped through my little notepad and noticed the first date I had scribbled down. Counted the days backward, just to see .30-2. Not a grand milestone, not a round number, but enough time to become someone new, or rather, to return to someone I hadn't seen in years. The version of me who paused when something was beautiful, who stirred sugar into tea just for the comfort of it, not for company, who didn't ask permission to be still. That morning I felt something shift, not a sharp break. Just a soft inner voice that said, "It's time." I knew what it meant. There was one more thing I needed to do, not out of obligation, not out of bitterness, but out of grace. I hadn't spoken to him since the meeting in the lawyer's office. No calls, no letters, no questions. He hadn't reached out either, which didn't surprise me. He'd always preferred to retreat when he wasn't in control of the story. Silence had become his favorite way to deny fault. But I didn't need words from him anymore. I just needed to finish the story on my side. That afternoon, I sat at the RV's little table and took out the stationery I'd been saving. Cream-colored, with faint gold edges. I'd bought it years ago, thinking I might use it for holidays or thank you notes, but I never had. I hadn't felt grateful enough for a long time. I smoothed the page flat and picked up my pen. Then I began. It wasn't a long letter. It didn't need to be. I started by telling him that I hoped he was well. Then, wrote that I knew how things had gotten to where they were, not through malice, but through erosion. That's how it happens sometimes. You don't even feel it until your feet are wet, till the shoreline that held you for so long is gone. I told him I didn't blame him, but I also didn't excuse him. I said that erasing someone's autonomy, even gently, even under the pretense of care, is still erasure. And that just because I had stayed quiet didn't mean I had agreed. I told him that I had rewritten the trust because I had to. Not to punish him, but to protect myself from a version of him that no longer remembered who I was. And then I told him something that surprised even me. I wrote that I forgave him, not in the way people say when they're trying to be holy, but in the real, quiet way, the kind that doesn't require reconciliation or understanding. It's distance and peace. I ended the letter with a single line. You don't need to respond. I just needed to say it. I signed my name. Not Mom, just. My full name written clearly and without apology. I folded the letter once, placed it in the envelope, and walked it down to the post office. I didn't second guess it. I didn't check the return address. I let it go, and when I dropped it into the slot, I felt something small and tight inside me finally uncurl grief. Maybe or the last little thread of needing to be seen by someone who had long ago stopped looking. I walked back to the RV slowly, noticing things I hadn't noticed before. A bench carved with initials, a tree bent in a perfect arc over the sidewalk. A white cat perched on a fence post, like it was guarding something sacred. Everything felt still and safe. That evening, I drove to a nearby clearing just outside town, where the sky opened up like a page. I made a small dinner, roasted sweet potato, a boiled egg, a square of dark chocolate, ate barefoot, legs crossed on the grass, watching the sun drop below the hills. Afterward, I built a tiny fire. I didn't do it for ritual. I did it because I could, because I wanted to feel the warmth on my skin and the flicker of light across my knuckles. I didn't burn anything symbolic. I didn't cry. I just sat there, letting the past fall further behind me, not with a crash, but with a hush dot at some point. I looked up and whispered a quiet goodbye, not to him, to the version of me who had waited so long for someone to hand her own life back. She had been patient, but I didn't need her anymore. I had already arrived. The fire burned low. I doused it with care, and when I climbed back into the RV, I wrapped the green scarf around my shoulders and fell asleep with the windows cracked just enough to let the night air slip in. No more noise, no more explanations, just rest. The good kind, the kind you earn after reclaiming your name and no longer needing to hear it said by anyone else to believe it's yours. The next morning, I woke before the sun reached the hills, not with a start and not from a dream. Just slowly, the way a leaf turns in the wind, knowing it's time to fall. There was a softness in my bones I hadn't felt in years. Not weakness, ease, as if all the bracing I'd done for so long, the tight shoulders, the careful breath, the holding in of my own needs had finally let go. I made tea and drank it outside, wrapped in the green scarf, bare feet pressed to the damp earth. A bird landed near me, one of those small gray ones that looks like it's always in thought. It hopped once, then flew off. And I thought, yes, that's what this is. Not escape. Flight, I wasn't running anymore. I was moving, and movement, when it's your own, doesn't drain you. It gives you back to yourself. Later that day, I found a local community board outside the general store. The kind with crooked thumbtacks and curled up flyers, piano lessons, a missing cat, someone selling zucchini by the basket. One sheet caught my eye. It said, Writer's Circle, Thursday evenings at the library. All ages welcome. Come as you are. I smiled at the last line. Come as you are. I wondered how long it had been since I'd done that. Really? Shown up with nothing polished? Nothing prepared. No role to perform. I took a photo of the flyer and circled the date in my notepad. Which Thursday, that evening, I arrived early. The library smelled like old pages and floor polish. A few people had already gathered in the reading room. 2 young women, one older man with a limp, and a middle-aged woman with ink-stained fingers. No one asked who I was. They just nodded and made space. The woman with the ink-stained fingers, her name was Beth, passed around small slips of paper with prompts on them. Nothing formal, just ideas. One said a room with no clocks. Another said the first time you left, I chose the one that said what you remembered after forgetting. I didn't think, I just wrote. And the words came faster than I expected. They weren't about the house or the betrayal or the letter I'd sent. They were about a swing in my grandmother's backyard and how the chains used to pinch my palms when I went to high. They were about the first time I saw snow, the way silence fell with it, like a blanket for the world. They were about my hands, how capable they'd always been, even when no one was watching. When it was my turn to read, I hesitated for half a breath. But then I looked at the faces around the table, all of them worn in different ways. All of them waiting without judgment, and I read. My voice didn't shake. Afterward, no one clapped, but they nodded. It's that slow kind of nod that says, I know exactly what you mean. And I felt something loosen in me again, like the final button undone at the end of a long day. When the circle ended, Beth came over and asked if I'd be back next week. I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. On the walk back to the RV, the night air was cool, and I left my jacket unzipped. The stars were quiet above me, but bright. I thought of how long it had taken me to feel like part of the world again, and how no one had done it for me. I had done it myself, not by yelling or slamming doors, just by choosing over and over to stay soft in a world that had tried to harden me. That week, I started learning names of people, of streets, of birds I hadn't bothered to identify before. I stopped in the bakery and asked for whatever had just come out of the oven. I helped a woman carry her groceries to her car when the paper bag ripped open in the parking lot. She looked surprised, then touched my wrist and said, "Thank you, dear," like she really meant it. I even called the ex-wife. Not to revisit the past, just to say hello. We spoke for 17 minutes about nothing and everything, about autumn arriving, about books, about how good it felt to be seen without being used. Before we hung up, she said something I've carried with me since. She said, "You sound like you're smiling again." And I was. I truly was not a smile for someone else. A smile for me because life had become small in the best way, not shrunken, focused. Every choice I made now felt like a thread in a quilt I was sewing by hand. It's a simple one. No patterns, no declarations. Just warmth stitched together in quiet rows. One night I found a small ceramic dish at a roadside shop, pale yellow with a crack down the center. I bought it anyway. I put it beside my bed in the RV and placed my rings in it, the ones I don't wear anymore but still keep close, that crack down the middle. It didn't ruin the dish. It made it beautiful. Something real. Something whole. Not despite the damage, but because of it. That's how I felt, now cracked, but useful, quiet, but whole, still here, but changed. And every morning, I rose with the soft knowing that I didn't have to ask anymore for permission, for clarity, for love, because I had finally given all of that to myself. It's been 3 months now. The RV smells like rosemary and paper. From the dried sprig I keep in a jar near the window and the stack of notebooks I've slowly filled with fragments of my days. I don't write every morning. I don't make it a rule. I only write when I feel like the words need somewhere to rest. And lately, they do. I'm parked near a river this week. Nothing dramatic, just a slow bend in the road where the water smooths over rocks and makes a sound like whispering between old friends. There's a bench nearby. I sit there most afternoons with a thermos of tea and a book I've already read twice. It's just for the comfort of sentences I know by heart. I've come to believe that peace doesn't arrive all at once. It trickles in. A breeze through the open window. A stranger's gentle smile at the farmer's market. A quiet Sunday where nothing hurts and no one expects you to explain who you are. There was a time I believed I had to earn peace. Now I know I just had to stop handing it away. The trust is secure. The house was sold last week. Quietly, cleanly. Through Claire's help and a woman named Dina who said she could imagine raising her daughters in it. I didn't go back to see it one last time. I didn't need to. That house had already said goodbye to me. I didn't owe it another look. Claire sent a photo of the closing papers and a short note that said, "You did this, start to finish, don't forget that. I won't." I used part of the money to open a savings account in a bank with no shared last names. I bought a small emergency fund, a pair of good walking shoes, and a donation to a shelter that helps women leave quietly when they need to, and the rest I'm keeping for days like today. Days when the sun is warm, but not loud. Days when I feel like cooking something slow and forgiving. Days when I want to remember how it feels to belong only to myself. Sometimes I still think of him, not often, just in passing, a flash of memory when I see a boy holding his mother's hand in the grocery store. A line from an old photograph tucked in my drawer. The way my tea tastes when I add too much honey, his habit. Not mine, but the ache is gone. It's been replaced by something quieter. Not forgiveness. Not even understanding. Just space. I don't check the mailbox for his letters anymore. I don't. Wonder what he tells people about me. That part of my life has closed like a door you no longer reach for in the dark. One afternoon, about 2 weeks ago, I walked to the river and stood at the edge of the water until my toes sank into the cool mud. I took a small, smooth stone from my pocket, one I'd carried for years, from a trip long before all of this, and I tossed it in. Not hard, not as a release. Just as a reminder that I could let things go without needing anyone to watch. That was the last time I felt the old version of myself tug at my sleeve. She's quiet now, not gone. Just resting. She knows I have it from here. There's a little shop up the road that sells postcards. I bought 3. One I sent to the librarian in Sparrow's Ridge. I thanked her for the yellow notepad and the mug of coffee. One I sent to the ex-wife, just because. It said "still here" with a green scarf and a full heart. And the last, I kept that one. I didn't write anything on it. I just pinned it to the wall of the RV, beside the window, beside the tiny crack in the wood where the sunlight slips in each morning and lands on the table like it's greeting me. The postcard is blank dot because sometimes the best endings don't need words, they just need space to breathe. I don't know how long I'll stay on the road. Maybe a year, maybe less, maybe more. But I'll know when it's time, and when that moment comes, I'll find a place with a garden, a quiet kitchen, and a window just wide enough to let the wind in without asking why it came. Until then, I'm here, reading, writing, walking slowly through towns that don't expect anything from me, saying yes when I mean yes, and no without apology, sleeping well, eating warm food, trusting my own voice again, not because it's louder now, but because I finally believe it. I was never too old to decide. Just too quiet for too long. Not anymore. Now I live in a house with wheels, a drawer of postcards, and a name I no longer whisper to myself for reassurance. I know who I am. I know what I've kept, and I know what I've walked away from without regret. Still here, still whole, still becoming the end. Now, I'm curious about you. Have you ever experienced something like this? Let me know in the comments. And if you've stayed with me until now, thank you. I'll leave you with 2 other stories I think you'll love.